Go again. Okay. So here we go. It's recording now. Okay. I apologize for all of the setup stuff just now, but we're all on right now, and I'm going to just jump right into talking about the course content and hopefully having some open discussion with y'all. And I'm going to do a real quick poll. Or not. Okay. I was about to do a poll, but how many of y'all were ever spanked as a kid? Anybody? Spanked, whooped?
Yes,
I
ma'am.
was.
I was. Definitely.
Me too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody have children? You ever spanked your kids? Put them in timeout? Other forms of discipline? What did your parents do to teach you right from wrong and to raise you up so that you'd be a good, productive, moral citizen, able to participate in the government and to be able to self-support and raise your own family someday? What'd your parents do to raise you up right?
Are you saying from a discipline point of view?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Spankings, timeout, knees in the corner, like kneeling in the corner, stuff like that.
Oh, kneeling in the corner. You knelt in the corner, Miles?
Now?
Did you kneel in a corner a time or two?
Oh, yes, ma'am. I hated it.
Yeah. I'll bet. How old were you?
I did that until I was maybe about 11.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So apparently you must have got it by then, huh?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, the reason I'm asking you that is because a lot of what we talk about, besides the introduction to that video that sort of exposed you to some of the content regarding what we look for in child abuse and neglect, we want to talk a little bit about history. And history in regard to how we respond to child abuse and neglect is really one of world history, you could say. And I think we talked some about infanticide before, but discipline typically has been often associated with violent management of children in a family, but not just children in a family, everybody in the family who was responsible for maintaining a family unit, okay? And in ancient times, and even in the Bible, as we might have talked about before, the means for doing that were extreme because times were much different and extreme. It was hard to live without water and electricity and all the things that we take for granted today, much less even roads or reliable transportation other than your feet, right? So over time and evolution of humanity, really, it's become less and less a need to have children in the majority of world civilizations. It's been less and less a need to have children managed in such a harsh way as, I don't know, like the Code of Hammurabi, where they could cut your eye out if you were a child or a slave or an indentured servant or your wife. In the Code of Hammurabi back in ancient times, you were head of your household until you died. And then the oldest son would take over that household, which include whoever was remaining out of your household when you got too old and died, plus whatever they created, right? So they might have their mother, say, Miles, your father, when you were living in BC time, before the Christian era time, and you were under the Code of Hammurabi, and your father died and you were the oldest son, but you had two other brothers. Those two other brothers were under your control, and you could do with them whatever you needed to do to make them toe the line for whatever are the rules of your household. Not only that, you could do that for your mother, you could do that for their wives, you could do that for their children. You were head of the household. And that's how it went, right? And it was very extreme. Well, obviously, in world civilizations today, we need people who are able to read and participate in a much more advanced world, technology, right? And as a result, we tend to not engage in violent means of raising children anymore. Although there are some who misinterpret and don't receive the adequate nurturance in childhood, nor discipline that's healthy in childhood that they need to move forward and to become independent, to become self-sufficient, to be able to be a good citizen, to maintain forms of government as well as economies. You got to do that by working, right? You've got to read. You got to be able to participate in reading the ballots in whatever country you're living in, if that's the means of selecting government. So when we talk about discipline, we are talking about much more than some of those parents who are abusive and neglectful understand. And really, because of the response y'all had, and I really should have, I didn't have time to get the poll set up this morning before my first class got started and so on. I wanted to see anonymously how many of y'all had actually been spanked or, disciplined in a way that today we might consider not the best form of discipline, right? The reason I like to ask that poll is because still to this very day, in the years that I've been teaching this course, which this was one of the first courses I ever taught in my life as an adjunct or part-time, we called it then, instructor, before I even had my PhD, but was working in social work, we would ask, how many of you have had spankings or whoopings or whatever you want to call them, got hit with something, hand, whatever. And overwhelmingly, the class would respond that they had. And furthermore, if I didn't take time out for the poll, you might respond to this, that it was good for you, made you who you are, that you might do the same with your kids, that your discipline wasn't that bad. In fact, it wasn't bad at all. Parents loved you. They took care of you. They met your needs. Maybe you contributed to getting you in college. Who knows? Supported you in other ways before you came to college, even if you're on your own. So you might think that it was a good thing. But really, discipline is much broader than that. And I'm going to explain this in regards to the information about understanding who and what responds to child welfare. We do need to understand that as we go forward in this class. And it necessitates a little bit of this background history, because discipline is often mistook to believe only in corporal punishment. Corporal punishment means the infliction of some kind of pain. We're not talking about torture, but some kind of pain to create what we would call in behavior theory, negative reinforcement, right? So we want positive reinforcement. And if you do something bad, you're going to get negative reinforcement. And the idea is that would extinguish behavior that is detrimental to your development as a child, that the parent believes is going to be beneficial. The problem is that not all parents are able to control just using corporal punishment if that's all they understand discipline to be. I always used to like to write on the board, which I'm not going to fool with trying to do that right now technologically, because still a digital immigrant, remember, so I've got to be careful to waste time with trying to figure stuff out. I don't want to do that. But I used to write on the board the word disciple and challenge you to think about where the word discipline comes from, because it comes from that word disciple. To discipline a child, therefore, is to make them the true meaning of the word. And I love etymology, which is the study of words. I'm not a PhD in the study of words by any stretch, but I was nerdy enough that I collected the Reader's Digest vocabulary and had a collection of those in the 5th and 6th grade on to this day. And fortunately, you can just click on the word now and Google will just pop up the definition and pronunciation. It's awesome. So I was real into words, and etymology of words are fascinating. And so it is with discipline. Discipline comes from disciple, and the meaning of that word that we associate with religiosity as an expression of faith, or faith leaders, or people who follow a particular faith practice like Christianity or Muslim or whatever. So we see for particularly Jewish and Christian faith practices in the Tenet Bible, and we see the word disciple. And in countries like ours in the United States, bringing that down to how we deal with child maltreatment, we tend to think of discipline as not necessarily coming from that word and understanding the full breadth. Because if you make someone your disciple, just take religion out of it. If you make someone your disciple, what are you making them? The true meaning of the word, I'm just going to tell you for sake of time, is follower. That's where it came from. So you're making that child your follower. So yes, corporal punishment is generally accepted, but it's accepted because it takes attitudes and time that long to shift, really, into understanding the knowledge that we build over time that can inform us on how better to raise children in whatever era we're living in. Now, we not only have to deal with, okay, what's appropriate discipline, making a child a follower of what? For us in the United States, citizens of the country that are able to participate in our government, you got to be able to read and write to do that, ideally. And you've got to be able to read and write to a decent level to be able to get a job that's going to keep you out of poverty, right? The better paying jobs are not going to come from dropping out of high school or even grade school, as my father-in-law did and managed to make a living. He's passed now, rest his soul. He'd be 100 years old this October. It was a different era. Today, some would say that even a college degree on the undergraduate level is not enough if you really want to advance yourself professionally in an industrialized, advanced, technologically advanced country like we are today, and most in Europe. So it's a different time. And childhood is something that is thought to be more indulged. There's a whole history that could go with that too, we could talk about, but I won't, I'll save that. And so we, in an article I just saw come across the Atlantic yesterday, a journal I like to read, a public journal, not a professional one, talked about how unindulged childhood, unencumbered with responsibilities, is something that children in our society need today. So we can talk about that, but let's stay with discipline for a minute. Discipline is part of that. Providing an unencumbered childhood is part of what we need to consider as part of discipline. Does that mean that you do not have rules? No, absolutely not. There are a lot of psychologists who have written in this field, from those who I've studied in attachment theory, from Ainsworth to, he'll come back to me in a minute. Many psychologists have studied this issue about parents and attachment, and how attachment forms relationships, and from that relationship between a parent and a child, or whoever is raising a child up to live in the world effectively, sufficiently, independently, that those individuals are making those children citizens of that country that you're being raised up in, and ultimately citizens of the world. Because as citizens of the world, think about it, those of us who come from countries that require this kind of advanced knowledge have a responsibility to bring others up along with us. Or at least that's the ideal of countries such as ours that are said to be, like leaders in the world. Leaders for what? Leaders to bring everybody up to a decent standard of living, to escape oppression, to escape death for whatever reason, just because you're poor, like people in Myanmar right now, that are still suffering oppression and being killed just because they're Muslims, even though they lived in the country, or Uyghurs in China who are Muslim and are being, if not killed, put into deprogramming environments for years. What is that? Is that humane? We would think not. Neither would many countries in Europe think not. Okay, so we have that obligation, and it filters down from how we raise up our children in America and in other industrialized countries like ours. But for us, discipline comes from creating that child as a follower. It involves not just managing behavior. Managing behavior comes from other means too. Can you tell me what those might be? Just best guess. What other means of making a child your disciple, your follower?
I suppose you could teach them instead of disciplining. You could, rather being physical, you could teach them verbally. What to do, what not to do. What do you expect?
Okay, so we're talking now about behavior management, child behavior management, teaching them rules, right? Okay, so teaching them forms of behavior management can include some physical punishment, but we're going to talk about what's reasonable and what's not, because that's part of the issues with the way our country responds to child maltreatment that is beyond the pale and dangerous, causes imminent risk of harm to a child and or loss of life or maiming. Most of y'all, I would think, might not, hopefully didn't experience that degree, right? So teaching is one. What's another obvious one? What do we think about our kids that belong to us? What do your parents think about you? How do you think they feel about you? It's part of discipline. Hopefully they love you. If they love you and show that to you and show that in various ways throughout your life as you have reached adulthood and now in this class, that you have been loved, you have been fed, you have been clothed, you have been educated, you have seen role models that are positive in your life. You may have hopefully been exposed to various other means of morality development that might include church, it might include being around friends or neighbors or communities or community groups where people are recognized or by your parents as moral people, whether or not they follow a faith practice, right? They have made sure you had something for Christmas. Maybe not a whole lot, but they made sure you had something if you practice Christmas. They made sure that if you were picked on or that a teacher bothered you or something was going wrong, they would try to help you resolve that and do it in a way that made sense. They edified you, they encouraged you, they built you up, they they made a home for you, they provided shelter. All things are really discipline. We actually say that discipline starts from the moment a caregiver takes a child into their home. For biological parents, we know that that actually starts at the moment of birth. It's not an accident that breastfeeding is a natural physiological response, because with breastfeeding comes the release of a powerful hormone that, oh my gosh, I wish through my life they could bottle this and put it into a pill form, and that's oxytocin. Man, you get it in a massive dose. You are so happy once you get that breastfeeding started with that baby. It's just amazing. And you know why? Because that facilitates attachment. It's not a lot of, if there are any women on here who've ever breastfed, or if you're married and have a spouse who breastfed, you might can attest to the fact that it's not a pleasant endeavor when it first starts. It's not. But once it starts and once other children are born afterwards, it becomes easier to do. And usually it becomes easier for women giving birth to their child within usually about the first 2 to 3 weeks. For maybe with the first time, it might take a little bit longer, but usually within that first month of the period we call a neonate, those first 28 days of life. And from that point on is when that oxytocin just goes crazy in your system, and it actually facilitates a kind of peacefulness that's necessary to relax for the drop down of milk for the nursing mother. That is an unbelievably beautiful biological design from whomever you believe it may have come from. Okay, so it's a human biological design that is truly perfect when it works well. It doesn't work well for all women, sadly, but the majority of women, it can and does work well. That facilitates something we call attachment for biological births. And that attachment then facilitates that mother to engage in that nurturing behavior, that hands-on and picking them up and, holding them and making sure they're nursed whenever they, are hungry or whatever, until they get to a pattern or a rhythm. So it's a beautiful thing how that happens. But that's not the only way that children bond or attach to their caregivers. Attachment occurs with time, and it occurs over time. In fact, that's the definition of attachment. It's a relationship that endures over time and place. You know that you have an attachment and therefore likely bonded with a parent or a sibling or a close friend that you've had since childhood or maybe college or whenever. You know that you have an attachment when it endures, even when you are hundreds, thousands of miles apart. The person you always go back to, the parent you can always talk to, the parent you can, or the aunt or uncle or godmother or godparent, whomever it is, your best friend from grammar school. I've got a child who has one of those friends from pre-K. She's in California. My daughter's in Alabama, and they're still close. They bonded early, and they have remained contacted and close. So they are attached over time and place. That's what attachment means. Bonding is that early dance that occurs in the first stages of a relationship. If any of you have ever had a romantic relationship, you have bonded. If you have had a significant platonic relationship, you bond in that as well. If you have a marital relationship, you bond not with just what we call agape in religious realms, but love of person with child, other caregiver, friends, so on. With your marital partner, you have that and intimate attachment, bonding that occurs. And that, of course, is the expression of sexual intimacy. Now let's pause there just a second, and we'll pick back up with discipline. That's where we are, okay? Because bonding and that attachment is part of discipline. Intimacy, when we talk about it in this course, can mean both sexual intimacy and personal intimacy. So you make sure you've got that. I'll reinforce that as we go through, okay? It depends on the type of relationship that we're talking about. Sexual intimacy is among adults sharing a personal, intimate relationship that involves sexuality. And that can involve marital pairs who are homosexual or bisexual or heterosexual. Okay, so make sure you're aware of that. I'll say that again, and especially when we start talking about indicators of sexual abuse as we go through this, because we're going to talk about all those forms of maltreatment. So back to discipline. The bonding that occurs in the beginning of any relationship, whether it's biological or one that is initiated non-biologically, at whatever age you are, is part of, in raising children, discipline. I always say, and I'm saying again, that the moment you take a child into your home, into your care, whether by birth, adoption, or kinship, meaning that there's no legal connection, but because you have an aunt or uncle who takes you in, but they never adopt you formally, or you have friends of the family, extended friends of the family, aunts, uncles that really aren't your aunts or uncles, or your godparents who really aren't biologically related to you. Those people who take you in are called kinship. Okay, so and we're going to talk about that as, of course, in regard to the treatment of foster parents versus kinship parents, because that's a whole category thing within the way that our country deals with children who are in state custody. So with discipline, from the moment you take a child into your care, that becomes your role for disciplining them for however long you have that child. If you have that child to raise them to adulthood, then you're disciplining them up to that point where they launch in self-sufficiency and their ability to provide for their own lives, right? So that involves love. It involves all of those things that I've just listed off for you. It involves the way you touch and care for a child. And yes, it even involves discipline by means of behavior management. Now let's talk about behavior management just for a minute, and what is appropriate behavior management and what is not. Now, I always have to be careful about this because there are variations of behavior management that some of y'all may have experienced that you might be shocked to know today might be considered borderline abusive. And that's because since 1974, with the advent of the Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act that actually created the system we have today as we know it, child protection, it's only been since that period of time, the last, 40 years, almost 50 years going on. So, well, wait a minute, is that 50 years? My math is terrible, so I'm a social worker. So all of those decades since then, we now have this cultural myth that child protection by the state is always after you, no matter what you do to your child. If you yell at them in the store, they're going to come get you. If you spank your child and your child tells somebody, oh my God, they're going to come and investigate you. That's not true, because there are what we call minimal standards in the child welfare system. And I want you to have this background today from our lecture, and I want to open it up for talk about this once I finish this little lecture. Because those misperceptions have had an unintended consequence to cause parents to try to be overly cautious about how they manage their children's behavior with corporal punishment. Okay. And it's led to what psychologists have called extremes in parenting, where we see that there's the very liberal or permissive parenting to the very authoritarian parent, and then the authoritative parent in the middle. Okay. What we want is a balance. We don't want to not discipline at all with behavior management and only love them and nurture them and give them everything they want, because that's not going to work. That can potentially create a personality disorder we call narcissism. Okay. And we don't want to be overly restrictive, because that then can lead to abuse and complex trauma that, you know, from the ACEs study you did, or test you did, and the reading so far on that, can lead to personality disturbances and problems in adulthood, later childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So, you know, you got to be somewhere in the middle, and that's what we're calling for. And that's where the state comes from. Okay. Minimal standards. So by that, we mean that children have, at a minimum, in the United States and industrialized worlds, and hopefully eventually every child throughout the world, the right to not starve. So they have enough to eat, but they also have enough to eat that's healthy. We have people living in poverty right in Marion, Louisiana, that I live in right now, and other areas like it, where the only place you can get fruit, and it ain't going to be fresh, or vegetables, is in the Marion market. We now have a Dollar General that came to town came to our village really about 3 years ago now, I guess, maybe 2 years really. Yeah, they sell milk and stuff like that, but they don't sell vegetables or fruits. So we have what's called a food desert. And what happens with that? Children suffer obesity because you don't have healthy foods available, right? Like we do in larger cities or places where you can access markets like that. And I don't know about Dash or whatever those delivery programs are, or even Amazon, if they can deliver stuff like that out to places like Marion. So rural communities suffer that. That's a whole other aspect we talk about in other courses, in social psychology and social work and other disciplines. But for us, we don't want children, for this course, we're more interested in children not starving, having enough to eat. And even if you live in a food desert, you're going to find something, hopefully, to eat and to be able to feed your children. It may not be the best stuff in the world, but at least they're not going to starve. We have a right to assure that we have the responsibility as caregivers of children to make sure our children have medical treatment when they need it, that they are receiving immediate care when they need it, that they are getting preventive care when they need it. And this includes, by the way, dental care. Dental care is probably some of the most inaccessible, in my opinion, health care that there is in the United States today. The reason? Because even insurances don't pay well for dental care. They really don't. And so what happens? You end up with a pretty big bill with children who you don't have insurance for, and you take them into the dentist, and if you don't have Medicaid or some other state form that will pay some portion of that, you're going to end up with a big bill. And so what do people who are poor have as a consequence? Children with poor teeth. That's what. Poor teeth can kill you, you know. It's not common, but it can. And not only that, it affects the appearance of the child, and that affects how they're accepted or not in their schools because of their appearance. So we have to treat our children in ways where they don't starve, they get their food needs met, they get their medical care needs met, they get their educational needs met, at least to the best level we can. Let's think again about poverty. Children who are in poverty today in the United States, and even in Marion, Louisiana, where my house is, children suffer getting to school, being able to have internet connection. I mean, that's a big deal right now. And COVID has sure brought that home. And I hope to every deity in the world, to my God, that we address that finally once and for all, because it's not going away. People do banking, people shop, people do everything online, but you sure can't do it if you're living out in the country very easily, because there's no broadband connection. And connections that are available are not high speed. So children are having to go from Union Parish, Marion, other communities around there. Oh, I have trouble staying on track if I have to stop and think about all the places I can't remember all the names of. Anyway, so they have to go up to the school parking lot or to a parking lot that's nearest to them without going that far into town to Farmable, which is 12 miles away. And if you don't have reliable transportation or somebody that's willing to take you, then your child didn't get their educational stuff then. That's why around the nation, and I saw in the news this morning a little scroll on the KNOE about the reading levels have dropped for the third year in a row. I bet they dropped a lot this year because children aren't getting what they need because we don't have broadband connection. So think about what I'm telling you in basic needs of children today and poor children, because that gets into areas of neglect and a responsibility for that. And that in turn impacts how states deal with children who are neglected. Okay. So just to rehash, food, nutrition, hospital care, medical treatment, education. I said earlier, even some moral development, no matter how you demonstrate that. One of the forms of abuse we're going to talk about in a little detail, actually some detail, in the forms of emotional maltreatment is what we call maladaptive behavior. Training a child up or demonstrating by your behavior as a parent dysfunctional behavior that the child learns and then goes on to repeat that dysfunction in ways that prevent them from being self-sufficient, independent, create problems in their lives. What am I talking about? Alcoholism, violence in the home, disparaging education, saying, oh, you don't need all that education. Well, you so, disparaging people in the family that are educated. So it discourages the children. They're not showing that example in that kind of discouragement of educational attainment. And there are other issues associated with that one too. So that's a biggie. But anyhow, so we have an obligation to demonstrate moral behavior and to not demonstrate behavior instead that is inappropriate or hurtful or doesn't teach kids how they ought to live in the world when they are independent. Okay. And we owe children the ability to feel safe. They need shelter to feel safe. And they need all of these other things to feel safe too, right? When that article in the Atlantic that I didn't get to read the whole thing, but what they were saying was that basically children today, by being indulged in childhood, actually develop more skills with the means of play that are available today. Some go too far, but children who are involved in sports that have evolved over the generations of the evolution of this country are very helpful in a form of play. Unless you get a coach like my son had one time in his elementary years, that was, don't you think I didn't talk to him about not just my kid, but all those boys, including his own son, that he would cuss out on the field. That's beyond the call, right? And not demonstrating, as in that instance, by the way, a temporary caregiver responsible for how those boys played that game. That coach had a responsibility to demonstrate to those boys how to play fair, how to play in a way to be a good loser, as well as a non-braggart winner, that you beat up on the other guys. In other words, when you lose, what do? Every time those boys, and we see it today, they go past and they clap each other's hands, don't they? If you know about sports and involved in that. I'm not a big athletic person, but I went to baseball games and soccer games and basketball games and never had one play football, but there you go. So that's part of indulging childhood, as long as it's done with the right people, teaching them. Having toys that you buy for your kids. And I'm not talking about buying a lot of toys. Kids can learn, if you overindulge children with too many toys or material things, they can learn not to respect their stuff, and then to expect that people will and others will provide whatever they need whenever they need it, and you don't have to worry about, tossing it or whatever. I hate to say it. I got grandchildren right now. They've got another grandparent that gives them literally everything on their Amazon list. These are 11, 9, and 7-year-olds. So you can imagine what's on their list. I kid you not. Their other grandmother, not this one, but their other grandmother's pretty wealthy, bought every living thing on their list and has their entire lives. So it shouldn't be a surprise that when they moved from San Antonio recently to Birmingham, they had these cabinets. And when I say it covered a big wall, it covered a wall twice as big as, which you can't see this wall, but twice as big as this. And it was like 3/4 of that wall was covered with these big cabinets that went up halfway up from the floor to the ceiling. And they had all their toys in there because it was a playroom. And you couldn't put anything together in there. If I showed you the pictures of when my daughter pulled all that stuff out when they were getting ready to move, it literally filled the room with just trash. We threw all of that away. So, not much teaching going on there, although my daughter and son-in-law tried a bit. Not much teaching going on there, not much disciplining about how to manage property, And as a result, given that my daughter has made some significant life changes recently and has begun to turn that around, we'll see if that works. I have hope, because children are resilient. We're going to talk about that too. So basic needs of children and discipline involves much more than corporal punishment. Corporal punishment, however, is a legitimate part of raising children up, especially in our culture. The reason is because it's something that we have historically maintained. And as I told you, if it takes time to change attitudes about managing children physically in any form, from killing them to putting their eye out, no joke. Hammurabi had a code where one of the codes was that he would, I just got distracted looking at the time, is that if a citizen had a child who was of age, meaning like a teenager, that we call it today, and refused to do what that parent wanted them to do, then that parent, that father really, could put that child to death at any age. And I don't know about y'all, but I had a pretty rough adolescence, and I'd have probably been dead many times over by the time I was 16, sadly. So, we don't condone obviously that, but that form of physical punishment has filtered down through the ages, centuries, to where now we still accept it. But we don't accept it in those kinds of harsh forms. And we haven't for a couple of centuries now, really more than that in some cultures, but it's still persisted, right? Just like the rule of thumb that came out of the 1700s England and found its way over here in this country, that the rule of thumb, do you know what the rule of thumb was in courts? The rule of thumb was that a man could beat his wife with a stick no bigger than his thumb. That's where it came from. Rule of thumb. No joke. You can look it up. And so, yeah, and that is from the beginning of our country to now. Think how, so using switches, using, something, anything, a paddle. A time or two, my mom tried to use those little paddles that they still have today that have a little ball on them that you can go, like this ping pong, or not a ping pong, but what do you call it? A paddle that has a rubber band stuck to the ball, and you hold the paddle and you go like this. You know what I'm talking about? She ripped that thing off and was going to use that to paddle me with. And she tried, but that's why I had a bad adolescence. I was difficult, you might say. Anyway, but she loved me well. We see corporal punishment as something that's still accepted today. And as a result, because we don't mandate or require parents to be licensed, we can't do that because of our civil liberties in this country, that parents today learn from their parents who learn from their parents who learn from their parents. And that's why if you had corporal punishment used for you, corporal punishment means some form of physical behavior management that can be a spanking on the buttocks, soft tissue area only. We're not talking about slaps in the face, head, socks in the, punching them in the stomach. We're talking soft tissue buttocks area. And then physical punishment is really only considered appropriate until the child reaches school age. The reason is because at that age, they're beginning to have peer influences, and certainly by middle school and adolescence or high school, there should not be physical punishment going on. But too many parents today, still today, this is 2 generations back for y'all, but my father, who recently passed, was raised up by his father, beating him up. His father was an alcoholic, beating him up amongst his drinking buddies in his living room when he was 17 years old, and he had to just stand there and take it till he joined the service, which helped him more than anything. In any case, that he says, and I believe it because he was my dad, right? So, so corporal punishment is something that we have to be very understanding of, is part of a negative response to negative behavior when you're trying to shape parent. But it's also in response oftentimes to parents who are scared, who are fearful of a child who may be running out in the road, and you run to go get them and you're so scared that you spank them all the way up the driveway, or you bring them in and you say, what are you yelling at them like crazy, and scaring the child even more. Say they're 5 years old and they've been out in the road, Is that abusive? Well, technically we'd say yeah, but is it abusive enough to cause what the public thinks, child abuse investigation? No. Okay. Can it be part of effective discipline? It absolutely can, because what would communicate to that child if that was the only time they heard their parent lose it to that extent by the grace of God? They learn that you don't go out in the dadgum street. That's what. They know that you better not ever do that again, because that was pretty damn scary, right? At that age, you would be really frightened by that. At 5, you would be, and it would stay with you. It would be one of those memories that would be amongst some of your earliest memories in childhood, because of the drama and the intense emotions it caused, and that you sensed from your caregiver that loved you and cared for you and provided all of your basic needs, and therefore disciplined you in a loving, effective way, right? So that leads us then, if we understand that, then we can begin to understand what the state agencies are and why they react the way that they do. Because we can't take a child away just because they got whooped on their butt. If there are no bruises there, you can't take that child away. And even if you have an adolescent that calls up the state and says, my mom just beat me, and and beat me where? Well, on my butt everywhere, and I got bruises on my butt. Well, okay, we'll come out and have somebody look at it, but they're not going to come out immediately, if at all. The reason is because the children who are reported for maltreatment, sadly, are significant numbers enough in any given community in the United States today that the agencies that are responsible for responding, for example, every parish in our state has an office of child welfare that provides a range of services, including investigation of maltreatment. So, and every office is located in a county seat. throughout the state. And that's true in every state, in every county. So yeah, they might come out, but they're not going to come out right away. And if there's not another report, then there's probably not going to be an investigation. Furthermore, anybody who does report, if you are not a social work major, but you are well, even if you are a social work major, but if you're any major, like if you're in education or, nursing or any field where you're going to encounter kids, then you're not going to get any feedback when you report to the state. And that's because of the laws. And you are not going to have a child removed from a home just because they did happen to leave a bruise on that adolescent who say was maybe, let's make him 13 years old. He calls up and the worker says, how old are you? And they say, I'm 13 and, I live with my mom. No, I don't have a dad. And she's picking up some other risk factors there that we're going to talk about. Then, they might come out a little sooner and not skip it altogether. But if they don't have any other reason, and there's not bruises beyond just the soft tissue on that butt, and there's no other old bruising, then they're not going to take that child out of the home. What they're going to do is try to keep it in the home and try to help that parent learn a better way of discipline, to embrace the good part of her discipline or his discipline and diminish the part that can get her in trouble, like the kid calling, okay? And oftentimes that's what we call family preservation, by the way, but oftentimes that family preservation is something that the worker goes in for a short period of time, works with that parent, maybe asks them to attend parenting classes. They do that for 6 weeks maybe, and they're out of there. And the reason is because states do not want to assume custody of children, even when they have to. But they do when they have to, because you cannot risk, and our society does not tolerate children left in homes where they can suffer abuse so severe they get killed or they're maimed. So with that, who are these people that do this investigation? Well, the ultimate agencies that are responsible come from that link of, oh, wait, where is it? Who and what? How did I have that labeled, y'all? I'm just scrolling up here. Okay. Ah, here it is. It's in unit. I knew I saw it in unit 1. There it is. Reflect who and what. Who and what constitutes the American response to child abuse and neglect? Well, first and foremost, today, currently, it is the public child welfare agencies mandated by federal law to exist in every state for the sole purpose of protecting children from abuse and neglect in their own homes or by their immediate caregivers, and by anyone who has been charged with even temporary care of a child. That coach I mentioned who was abusive to his child, I did not report him, but he could have been reported. The word was, among the gossip of parents in the stand, that he also beat his wife. So who knows? But you can't do that on just gossip, right? And yelling at kids is not going to necessarily get a report. So, but I probably should have really. In any case, child welfare agencies exist by federal law. And I mentioned earlier the 1974 Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. That Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act is, as I said, what was evolved after the public had an uprising of recognizing in 1960s with Henry Kemp's publication of the battered child syndrome in the Journal of American Medical Association about how children were indeed being abused in their own homes. But you know what? That's what we know in the history of child maltreatment generally, but really it started with a guy named John Caffey back during World War II, who, with the advent of use of x-rays, when he came back to the States, was using x-rays with children and was seeing what he saw as evidence of maltreatment, but it didn't get picked up. He didn't publish about it in the same way that Henry Kemp did. and how it got published in the way that he did, because he called it straight out. This is battered child syndrome and we need to do something about it. Public heard about it, news media picked up on it, and bam, there you go. Public says, you got to do something about this. Legislators in the state into the federal government, you got to do something, because states couldn't do it on their own. So we had the evolution of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. And from that, states' welfare departments were in place in states as a result of the Social Security Act in 1935, which also doubled as a child protection. But sadly, they mostly removed children from parents who couldn't provide for their basic needs out of concern that those kids would become delinquent. So a parent whose spouse died, most notably in that era, it would be the mother who died and the father working, caring for those children. He had to work because fathers were the primary caregivers in that era, right? And so workers would go from the state out and remove children permanently from their fathers because they should be working, not caring for children. Different attitudes, different times, right? So that created welfare departments, but they were mostly concerned about keeping kids in line and being supervised so they'd become good citizens, whatever. And not so much about abuse necessarily. Well, 68, 74, Child Abuse Acts passed. Federal government says, okay, states, you got states' rights to do what you choose is best for you, but we're going to require and provide money for you, half of the cost of providing care for children in separate state agencies. And that's where many of my colleagues, for example, who many have retired, worked for state, saw the breaking up of welfare departments with child protection, foster care, and adoption, which by the 70s had kind of evolved in a specific practice arena and was done by social workers. But because of that act, social workers were no longer the only discipline providing for that, because states suddenly had to, truly had to suddenly hire people to meet the need of a whole new agency. And that's why they declassified the job description and title to social service related degrees and specialties, like somebody who's worked in childcare, So we've come a long way since then, and we've kind of reclaimed that field because it was ours for a long time, meaning social work profession. And we're kind of gradually reclaiming that thanks to the Children's Bureau, which evolved in the early turn of the century, the turn from 19th to 20th century. So now we have in every state child welfare departments, and they're called public child welfare, PCW, and that's what you're going to see in abbreviations from now on. And then we have in each state, because you have the right to organize your state in a certain way, but there are certain things that are required. One is anonymity. The reason for that is so that the public will respond to protecting children. The rationale being that the more people who are involved, even the person on the street, for seeing a child who needed to be rescued, could reduce the incidence of children who are maltreated and who would die from maltreatment. The second was mandated reporters. There are certain people who are responsible because of their interaction with children, teachers, social workers in any capacity, because we work in lots of different settings, even schools, healthcare providers of all stripes and sorts, anybody who does physical therapy, a podiatrist. Did I mention why a podiatrist? Because children oftentimes get burned on their feet by sadistic parents, and that's a way to cover it up and not get caught. It's a real thing. Let's see, teachers, daycare workers, anyone who is in a professional capacity has a responsibility under state laws and federal reinforcement of state laws to report maltreatment. The states have the right to determine what that penalty will be. If you are a mandated reporter who interacted with the child, did not report that child went on to be killed or maimed as a result of ongoing maltreatment that you witnessed in your interaction, then you can be fined and or sent to jail, $500 and or 6 months in jail. Question is it enforced? Very rarely. And the reason is because there is professional protection, particularly among doctors and allied health professionals, even social workers, sadly. So, and then there's the issue of supervision. Teachers often have to report it to their principals before they report. Some states have guidelines like that. When that happens and the supervisor or the principal says, no, we're not going to report this, then that falls on the principal. You escape responsibility, falls on the principal. But under the law, you can report anonymously. But God help you if your principal finds out and he's that kind or she's that kind of person, because you may suffer retribution in any number of ways, even though it is illegal under state and federal laws. They're not supposed to, retaliate against you if you report anyway, even if you do it anonymously. But if it gets back, that happens. It does happen. There are definitions that states must have, and they have to meet minimal standards, defining a child, defining what is the various forms of abuse the state chooses to address, defining them in very specific ways. There are also laws in public child welfare of how courts will operate in determining when a child will be removed from a parent, and when instanter orders, 24-hour removal of a child, even in the middle of the night, has to have a court approval. How those work. All of those are parts of the details in public child welfare practice that we'll be talking about. And then in Louisiana, we used to call this the Louisiana Children's Code. It's now called the Louisiana Children's Justice Act, which I like a lot better. I'll back home at the last 4 years. So you might want to look at that. Also look at the, you're not seeing my screen, shoot. The Louisiana Department of Children and Family Services now combines on its website all of the services that it offers, from public welfare, like supplemental nutritional assistance program, to temporary assistance for needy families, to Medicaid applications, so on, to now also include the child welfare agency part, okay? And states are beginning to move a little more towards this, which is kind of good, although they still largely don't share the same offices anymore. My colleagues used to belabor that because they said, well, we used to could talk to somebody who was reported for neglect and ask them if they were getting, temporary assistance to needy families, if there was a case there and what kind of record they had, but they couldn't do that anymore because of the separation of the offices. So always unintended consequences. Well, y'all, I don't want to go overtime again, which I've done in the past, and I don't want to do it again. It's 1:43 by my computer, and I have just gone on and on. Your ears have got to be tired because my mouth is tired. So there you go. Any questions? Last minute.
Dr. Savage,
Yes,
have you uploaded the updated syllabus yet, or?
I did. I sent you out an email about that and put it on the board, announcements. Did I not open it or something?
I have to recheck. Okay. I mean, I haven't seen it. Maybe I looked over it.
No, it's there. Go up to the top of your page where the main heading is. Announcements, extra credit, course syllabus and outline. Make sure I didn't attach that where it says final. Yeah, because I did it all in purple because I'm color coding my courses so I can keep up with them. Yeah, 2021. I did.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Let's see if this is the course I put the Jeopardy button on. Countdown. Okay, all right, it's 1:45. I'll stay on a minute more if wants to ask a question, but you can leave the course safely.
Thank you, Dr. Savage. Have a good day.
You too. Okay.
Dr. Savage, did you take attendance?
I did not.
Okay.
Remember, I'm doing 10. It's on the syllabus, the updated one clarified. 10 actual roll calls counts for attendance points. And then class participation, I'll check 4 times each unit. Okay. So probably at the end of this week, just giving you a heads up, I'll probably check this weekend when I catch up, because we have that Tuesday. We have Tuesday, we don't have class because that's a Warhawks day off. Are y'all aware of that? Okay. So I'll probably be having a long weekend catching up stuff there. So yeah, so I just check your course participation, make sure you're actually spending some time on the videos, reading the course content material. Because of course,
Yes, ma'am.
when you do your assignments, that's, you know, duh, you got to be online to do those, right?
Yes, ma'am. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Nope. Okay. Tanisha, are you still on?
I am. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing any questions.
Okay. No questions. We're done.
Okay. All right.
All right. Have a good day.